So I'm going to go over a few of the supplies that you would need to create your own oyster mushroom production at home kit, essentially using a 5-gallon bucket. So here I have my 5-gallon bucket. This one came with a lid, so you want to make sure that you have that lid as it's important. I drilled in about 1/2-inch diameter holes throughout the bucket, usually somewhere between 15 to 20 holes that are made in a 5-gallon bucket will work fine. This bucket is also food grade, which will be important anytime you grow something in a bucket. You want it to be food grade. So this is essentially the drill bit I used, and then also you don't really have to have an expensive drill. Any cheap one from the store will work just fine. A few other things that you will need, of course, is going to be the spawn. This one here I purchased is grain spawn. You can see that the mushroom or the fungus is growing well throughout that. That's what you want to see. If I got this in the mail and it had green splotches all over it, then I probably wouldn't want to use that for my inoculation. I would contact the company to return it. But these bags usually come with a filter on the top as well. That's important. You need some air in those bags before you use them. If you get spawn in the mail and you're not going to use it immediately, you can store it for a short amount of time in the refrigerator. Make sure that you check the manufacturer specifications so that way you can determine how long that spawn will last before you absolutely have to use it. A few other things that I have is we're going to use pasteurization method for this example that I'm going to do. One thing that I would recommend is you don't necessarily have to have food grade weights. You can use something like a rock or a brick. Just make sure you know where it came from. But you're going to need that to weight this down in the pot. For this I bought a 20-quart pot that will be used to pasteurize my straw, or in this case I'm going to be using hay as my media for that fungus to grow on. I want to fill that pot with water, and then I'm going to want to make sure that I have a thermometer to measure the temperature, because remember, for pasteurization, temperature has to get up to a certain point to kill off most of those organisms that might become competitors later on. I'm also going to be using pillowcases in this situation. You can use something like a burlap bag to put the straw in when you put it in the pot. You don't want to put the media directly into the pot. It really should be placed in something. So in this case, we're going to be using pillowcases. I'm going to be using twine to tie off those pillowcases once they're done, after we let that bag of media cool. And of course, throughout the process, make sure that you're practicing good sanitation. I have here alcohol that I'm going to use to make sure that my hands are clean, as well as the surfaces that media will come in contact, or that spawn is clean.
The first step of this process is to fill the 20-quart pot up to 2/3 of the way full with water. Too full, and when you add your media, which in this case is going to be the alfalfa mixed hay, the water will overflow. Not enough, and the hay will not become completely submerged, and some sections won't get up to the correct temperature for pasteurization to occur. In the sink on the right is a pillowcase containing hay that has already been pasteurized and is in the process of draining. Prior to using this sink, it was sanitized before any of the supplies came into contact with it. Once water has been added to the pot, move the pot to the stove and set the temperature on the highest setting. In this demonstration here, I am using an alfalfa blend hay. It is actually not recommended to use hay for 100% of the media or substrate, although alfalfa hay can be mixed in with other substrates such as straw. Hay is often more expensive and more prone to bacterial contamination due to the high nitrogen content. Oysters may also have trouble fruiting in this media due to the high nutrient value. But in this case, hay is what I have on hand for this demonstration. Supplemented straw is one of the most common substrates used to grow oyster mushrooms and has a greater success rate. For a 5-gallon bucket, you will likely need to fill 2 pillowcases or burlap bags of the media that you do end up deciding to use. Whichever material you decide to use, just make sure it is permeable so the water does come into contact with the media. Once the pillowcases are filled, they were tied off with twine. Once the water begins to boil, check the temperature to make sure it is up to a minimum of 170 degrees Fahrenheit. I then added one of the bags of hay to the water and weighted it down with the food grade weights. As you can see here, unfortunately the weights were not enough to hold down the hay. I ended up filling another pot of water and placing it on top of the hay to completely submerge it. Make sure that the thermometer is reading the temperature in the middle of the pot. I noticed that the weight of the bag was sometimes causing the end of the thermometer to come into contact with the bottom of the pot. The temperature there might be at the level that you want, but in other areas of the pot can be cooler, especially closer to the surface, and cause sections of the hay not to get up to the temperature necessary for pasteurization. During this process, the temperature remained between 170 and 200 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the pot. This hay was heated this way for 2 hours. After 2 hours had passed, the pot was removed from the stove and placed in the sink. You may need to wait a few minutes for the top of the bag to cool off. In this case, once the weights were removed, the end of the bag just floated to the top of the pot, and I was able to fish it out with a clean pair of tongs. I pulled the bag of hay out and placed it into the adjacent sink, which you actually saw earlier in this video. The water was then drained from the pot, refilled, and placed back onto the stove for the second pillowcase of hay. Once finished, both bags were left in the sink overnight to cool. It's important to remember that the temperature of the hay needs to drop for inoculation, otherwise you risk killing the fungus that you want to grow. The following day, I began layering hay and spawn in the bucket. Check moisture of the hay before placing into the bucket to make sure that there is enough water. Essentially, when you squeeze a handful of hay, some water should come out in a few drops, but it shouldn't be drenched, nor should it be dry. The inside of the bucket was cleaned with 70% isopropanol and dried prior to use, and I also sanitized my hands before handling the spawn. Oyster fungi are one of the best mushrooms to begin with because they can outcompete many other organisms that will feed on the media. That said, it is still best to be as clean as possible to avoid contamination. About half a pound, or 10 to 20% of bucket volume of spawn should be adequate for the bucket method. I'm using more than this in the hopes that colonization will be fast enough to show you a finished product, but this amount of spawn is not very cost effective under normal circumstances. With each layer, be sure to pack down the media. For straw and hay, you want to pack it down as much as possible. Too many air spaces might make it more difficult for the fungal threads to grow in between the media or hay particles. This means more energy is spent on vegetative growth than on fruiting, and packing reduces these spaces. Keep layering until the bucket is full, then add the lid. Also, if you notice I am doing this on carpet, you can see that it creates a bit of a mess covering the floor. So covering the floor before beginning this process will help reduce that mess and make it easier to clean afterwards. Here is what your oyster bucket should look like once it is filled. It will take about 2 to 3 weeks to colonize and an additional week to fruit or produce mushrooms. I have a humidifier set up behind the bucket to maintain humidity should it become too dry. Ideally, buckets should be incubated at 77 or around 77 degrees Fahrenheit. However, this room is currently variable between 74 and 75 degrees Fahrenheit, so growth might slow slightly in this situation. It is now 10 days after the hay has been inoculated with spawn, and you can see that colonization is going well. We only see white mycelium growing in the hay. If we have blue, green, black, or any other discoloration, it would indicate that we have a contamination issue that may have come from the media not being properly pasteurized, or too much moisture occurring in the bucket. Luckily, oysters are more forgiving than other cultivated mushroom species.
everybody. We're here to talk about direct marketing license fees. I am Rob Lees, agricultural educator in Delaware County, and I'm here with our licensing fees expert, Mary Griffith, our educator from Madison County. We're just going to take about 5 minutes here and go over what you need to do as far as licensing and fees when you get into direct marketing. So Mary, you want to go ahead and take it away?
Sure thing. Hello, everybody. So we're going to talk for a minute here about what types of licenses and fees you need to enter some direct marketing channels. Basically, what we're talking about with direct marketing is any marketing channel where a producer is selling a product directly to the consumer. So today we're talking mainly about farmers markets and roadside stands, which are also called farm markets. So what types of licenses and fees do you need to sell products at these agencies? We get this question a lot. There are two primary agencies involved in regulating direct marketed foods in Ohio. Those agencies are the Ohio Department of Agriculture and your local health department. So I want to talk about what types of licenses they expect from you as a producer. I'll back up for a second because we get this question a lot as far as what about the licenses and fees that the market requires. So your market, the farmer's market where you sell your products, may have fees, may have rules, may have regulations. Those vary depending on the farmer's market, and you will talk individually with your farmer's market manager about any fees or rules or regulations that are specific to that market. We're just talking about the statewide rules right now. So the first license that you want to think about getting is for anybody that's selling potentially hazardous foods. And what we mean by potentially hazardous, what's included under that umbrella are meat, including fish, eggs, and dairy products. Those are things that we consider potentially hazardous, meaning if they're not held at particular temperatures, they could become unsafe to eat. So this license is called a Mobile Retail Food Establishment License. It is issued by the local health department, and it's issued by the local health department in the county where your farm is located. It doesn't matter which farmer's market you're going to and which county the farmer's market is located in. This license is for people, is issued by the health department where your farm is located. It is good for 1 year, and it might require commercial equipment, and in particular what that means is this will require some kind of refrigeration in your transportation. So this is a license, again, for people selling potentially hazardous foods, meaning meat, including fish, dairy, and eggs, and it's for people who are specifically going to be transporting those foods to a farmer's market. So if you're selling your food directly off your farm, you do not need this. This is just for if you are transporting the food. So it'll require some kind of refrigeration for you in transportation. The fees are going to vary a little bit by county. Another option for people who are selling products off their farm and they need that transportation license, if you're only selling your product at an event that's 1 or 2 days or a temporary event compared to a farmer's market where you're going to be going week after week after week for an extended period of time, is called a temporary food license, also issued by the county health department. This is something that's for more of a 1 day or 2 day type event. There are going to be some other licensing options depending on if you're producing another type of food. You might have some fees, some inspections required. Here's some examples. If you're a home bakery, if you are selling frozen food, canned food, any type of processed food, you will need to contact the Ohio Department of Agriculture's Division of Food Safety and find out what types of inspections are going to be required. That's about it. The last thing I want to say, if you're selling off your farm market, you will want to register your farm market through the Ohio Department of Ag every year. Thank you, and I'll talk to you next time.
Hi, I'd like to introduce you to eastern hemlock or Tsuga canadensis. It's one of the few native conifers or cone-bearing trees that occur naturally here in Ohio. It typically grows in the unglaciated hill country of Ohio in the southern and eastern portion of the state, but it does occur from the river all the way up to Lake Erie. It's not widespread though. It occurs in small pockets or populations, typically in unique habitats like this, deep sandstone gorges or steep north or east facing slopes. There is one or two exceptions though. The Hocking Hills area has a lot of this type habitat, so we have a lot of eastern hemlock there. We also have quite a bit of it here in Jackson County in the Rock Run area, including Lake Catherine State Nature Preserve, and then you're also probably aware of Mohican State Forest and State Park up to the north. But again, eastern hemlock is a conifer. It's a needle-bearing tree. It's evergreen, so it'll keep needles year-round. The needles are very short. They're only about a ½ inch in length, and they're not sharp-pointed. They're more rounded or blunt. If you flip the needles, the twig over, the branch over, you're going to see two white lines or two rows of what we call stomates. Stomates are those pores that allow gas exchange to occur in a tree. They'll take up CO2 and give off oxygen and water vapor through those stomates. But again, two white lines on the underside of the leaves or needles. The needles also occur in two rows or two ranks. It's a good ID characteristic. If you look at the branch, most of the needles are going out one side or the other, and you can lay that branch on a flat surface. It lays down very well. Think of two rows or ranks of soldiers marching down the road. Again, these needles are two ranked. I also mentioned it's a cone bearer, but it produces some of the smallest cones that you'll ever see. Eastern hemlock cones are only about 3/4 of an inch in diameter. They're usually loaded with lots of cones, so that's a great ID characteristic. And then when we look at this tree, we look up through the canopy, you're going to see almost no light penetrating. Eastern hemlock is very shade tolerant. It's what we call a climax species that can grow or regenerate in its own shade. So if you look at a stand of eastern hemlock, it's not uncommon for it to be the dominant tree out there, and the only thing regenerating under it is eastern hemlock. Sometimes it forms such dense shade that even eastern hemlock can't regenerate there, and you need a tree gap to be able to regenerate it. Another great ID characteristic, if you look at this big hemlock behind me, is that it's a poor self-pruner. Because it's so shade tolerant, and we've got a squirrel back here competing with me, so I apologize for that. But because it's so shade tolerant, it doesn't shed or prune those branches very well on its own. So those branches hang on for a long time. It's got deep furrowed bark. It's a beautiful tree. And again, we find it in these very unique habitats like this with these deep sandstone gorges. We do have a few concerns about eastern hemlock. There is a non-native insect pest that's threatening this tree. It's called hemlock woolly adelgid. You can go to the ODNR Division of Forestry's webpage to find out about that insect and what the Division of Forestry and partners are doing to try to control hemlock woolly adelgid, because we certainly wouldn't want to lose hemlock from our ecosystems, especially places like the Hocking Hills or Lake Catherine or Mohican State Park and State Forest. This is red maple. It's one of the soft maples that is very common in Ohio. It occurs throughout the state. Red maple have simple leaves. Each leaf typically has 3 lobes. The sinuses or the gaps between the lobes are not very deeply cut. Occasionally these will have 5 lobes. You'll also notice the edge of the leaf has teeth. So you got the major large teeth and then smaller fine teeth in between. That's what distinguishes the soft maples from the hard maples. Red maple and silver maple have the fine teeth. Sugar maple and black maple do not have fine teeth. Again, 3 to 5 lobes. The petiole or the leaf stalk will turn red a bit later in the year typically. And like all maples, the leaves are arranged in an opposite fashion. So you'll have one leaf on each side of the twig. Branching will be opposite. It will produce these beautiful little red flowers, clusters of drooping flowers early in the spring. They'll develop into the paired wing fruits. Those paired wing fruits will mature in late spring to early summer. This tree was loaded a few weeks ago and now there are no fruit left on the tree. I'm not sure if they matured already, it's June 1st, or whether the late frost actually knocked them off of this tree. This time of year it's really tough to look at buds, but a great identifying characteristic of red maple is that it'll have these rounded, bright red buds that'll occur. The twigs will be a light brown or a gray color. Fruits on maple are paired wing fruits. We always think about them as the little helicopters you toss in the air and they spin down. Bark on red maple is smooth and gray typically when it's small in diameter. As it gets larger, it tends to flake off a bit more. It also likes really shaded conditions. It can survive and grow in almost total shade. And then as it grows, it can work its way into the canopy and dominate in the forest. Red maple, a very common species in Ohio.
I want to talk to you a little bit about chainsaw safety and personal protective equipment. First thing on my list of items that I want to wear when I'm operating a chainsaw is a hard hat with a full face shield, earmuff protection, and the hard hat being in good shape, something that's not very old. Hard hat has a very short service life. OSHA recommends 3 to 5 years on a replacement cycle. So if you can't remember the last time you bought a new hard hat, it's probably time for a new one. They work very well. Unfortunately, I've had the opportunity to find out how well, but they do their job. And I'm very thankful that I had mine on the day that I got hit. So the hard hat's an important thing to have on your head, protecting your eyes and your ears, because you only get to use that once. This is a pair of chaps that were issued to some of my students in class. How this has happened twice is beyond me. So we have a cut leg here. And we have a cut leg here. This is a rare occurrence here, a right leg cut as opposed to a left leg cut. I don't know how this happens. I don't know who had these on. I don't know the instance. I don't know that I was around when this happened. But this is a pair of chainsaw chaps. And inside of the chap is some protective material that is in a multi-weave fashion, kind of a checkerboard over-under kind of thing that when the chainsaw cuts the material, it pulls out fibers from the top and the bottom and both sides. So when you make a cut on the chaps, it pulls material from the top and the bottom and removes protection from all areas of the chap in order to stop the chain. So the material in itself is not cut proof. It is a jamming agent. What it is designed to do is come out of the chap and get sucked up into the sprocket tip of the saw and into the side case of the saw so that chain stops. When that happens, there's a cleanout procedure that we're going to go over here in just a little bit. But the big thing is that if and when you cut a pair of chaps, you take them out of service. They've done their job. You need a fresh pair. You need a new pair of chaps to go back to work in so that you can prevent unnecessary injury. You also want to wear some gloves while you're running the saw to reduce vibration in your hands, a good sturdy pair of work boots, so that you got some traction as you're working and moving so you don't slip and fall as you're operating the saw. I think that covers our personal protective equipment. So I want to talk to you about a pre-start inspection of your chainsaw. So there are some safety features built into the saw that you need as an operator to make certain that they're functioning and in good order. So starting at the top, we have a chain brake. And its function is to stop the chain from turning either manually in activation with your hand or by inertia if you encounter kickback. Underneath of the muffler underneath of the chain brake is the muffler, and checking to make certain that the muffler is in good working function and doesn't have any holes, dents, or cracks in it. Making certain that the spark arrestor screen is in place because fire season is upon us, and that's important stuff to have in place. Underneath of that, we have a metal or plastic device that's called a chain catcher, and its sole function is to catch this chain if it derails or breaks, so it doesn't fly back and hit your leg or climb up your forearm as you're operating the saw. That's also why this rear handle is wider back here to catch that chain in a derailment situation. Back here at the trigger, we have an interlock system where your hand must be wrapped all the way around the handle in order to engage the throttle. So if you don't have your hand wrapped around here, you shouldn't be able to squeeze the throttle. So this one is functioning correctly. And then an overall inspection of the saw. So we're looking for loose nuts, bolts, and screws, things that are going to ruin our day when we go to work, right? So there's nothing worse than going out, getting all the way to where you're going to work, and you pull on the cord and find out that it's frayed and the handle pops off in your hand, and you watch that cord suck up into the side of the chainsaw. So inspecting it to make certain that it's not all frayed, chewed up, and ready to break. Making certain that all our screws holding everything together are tight and in place. So that's a pre-start inspection. Those are the things that we're looking for in order to make certain that our saw is safe to use for